All right, welcome to the last round of the France versus France segment, where we look at the French tech ecosystem. We have a very special guest who's going to be here to discuss the figures that you just heard about, among plenty of other subjects. For a year and a half, she has been the French Minister of State for Digital Affairs. She's been a tireless advocate for the French tech ecosystem. And actually, next week, she plans to unveil projet de loi, a new proposed law in France for the covering the digital ecosystem. So please welcome French Minister of State, Axelle LEMAIRE. All right, so welcome.
Thank you.
Just to kick this off, we just heard some very interesting figures about the French tech ecosystem, growth and revenue for companies, growth and investment in these companies. From your point of view, what is the figure in your role that you see as the most encouraging for the ecosystem that we just heard?
The growth rates, because they're really on the increase compared with the previous years. So it means that startups are actually becoming scale-ups, which is exactly what we want them to become. And I suppose the level of companies using the public tools that were created for the French tech and for innovative SMEs to grow is also a very good and positive sign that the French tech movement sees very effective results at the moment.
You mentioned positive growth and some of the, in terms of investment, there was a figure that you put out earlier today. What was that about the foreign investment in the French tech ecosystem? It had grown by how much?
Well, generally in France, I think it was last year, the level of foreign investment raised by 12%. But that's not only in the tech ecosystem, it's in general. But when we look at the first semester of 2015, the volume of capital risk investment, venture capital, raised by 70%, 7-0, which is extraordinary because that's exactly what the problem is at the moment for startups. It's to find fundings. It's to be able to raise funds. And it's interesting to see that a quarter of the funds raised are raised with foreign funds. And I think that's a very, very interesting trend because it means that the ecosystem is opening and maybe also that foreign VCs are getting more and more interested by what's going on in France at the moment.
So okay, so that's the good side of the story.
Yeah, exactly.
Tell me, what was the most disappointing thing that you learned?
Well, if you know about my convictions in that field, I think reading that 91% of the entrepreneurs are male is clearly worrying. It means that there's a problem. So we need to do more about this because in other business sectors, it's not that bad. So that's one thing.
What can be done? I mean, apart from having female ministers of digital affairs.
I hope it helps to some extent. I think also promoting entrepreneurship at a young age for young women. That's what we're doing with La Grande École du Numérique. The French president will launch that new program on this coming Thursday, actually by organizing a hackathon in the Élysée Palace. And the idea is to target young people and especially young women to convince them to come and work in the digital sector, even if they're unemployed or if they're not qualified, if they don't have any specific diploma. So I think that's a real challenge for the ecosystem, is also to be open to other sorts of people, because 75% of the current entrepreneurs or employees in startups have a master's degree, which is good because it means that's one of the key factors of success for the French ecosystem. But now the matter, especially for, public policies, which I'm in charge of, is to scale up, to generalize that system to a larger population. We want this society, this country, and its public entities to become startups in themselves.
Well, so talking about what the public authorities can do in this sector, I mean, among those figures, we saw that half the startups in the sample didn't use the young innovative company tax credit that was there, and the new CIE, the innovation tax credit, 70% didn't use it. I mean, do those things work? Is it make sense for the government to be involved in those kinds of incentives in the first place, or what needs to be done?
So the Jeune Entreprise Innovante, Young Innovative Company, is a very specific tool. I think it concerns not more than 7,000 companies in France over the last 6 years. And it's very, very difficult to get selected, and it's for highly technological companies. So that's probably not the best example because it's simply difficult to benefit from that. But to me, the striking figure is about the crédit d'impôt recherche, the tax credit exemption, which for research and development, 71%. It shows that it works, and this is actually, I think, another advantage of the French ecosystem, which is probably the most attractive in Europe when it comes to promoting investment in R&D for innovative companies. So it means it works, and the conclusion I draw from that figure is that we clearly shouldn't change it. And this is exactly what the Prime Minister and President want to do, is to ensure that it's being maintained in the long term. So now it's about ensuring an easier implementation, less controls, and that's encouraging to see that there are little less control compared with last year. Another very encouraging figure is le CICE, so that's more tax exemptions but for labor costs. And again, it shows the first year it's being used by companies, and it shows that it's not only traditional enterprises using it, but also startups, because it's actually open for any kind of company. So these are a series of fiscal tools that have been created really for businesses, and it also shows the level of involvement of the French government when it comes to supporting business in France.
Do you think, and this is a question, I guess, that gets a little bit to the philosophy of how one encourages innovation from the get-go, and obviously different countries have different ways of approaching this, but do you think that the government, with tools like that or other tools, should be more involved in trying to promote innovation in France, or should be more getting out of the way? What's your role from here?
I very often hear entrepreneurs telling me, the less involved the state is, the better it is for us. And I can understand that, but usually they're the same who will come and ask us to help them when they need it. So I think the level of investment from the state can always be higher, but it's not only in giving out money, it's also in making the system more simple. And that, I think, implies reforming the system itself, which is why I was recently in the US. I went to visit the city of San Francisco and the people in charge of innovation in New York. And what I would like to do is import the concept of state startups, which is a way to function, to take decision, to find solutions, which is common in the startup ecosystem, but not so much within the administrations. That's also one of the main objectives that we're trying to pursue, is simplify all the admin, all the red tape when it comes to dealing with companies from an institutional and public point of view.
A couple people on stage here have said, when it comes to what needs simplifying most of all, and there's work that's been done on this, but it's the labor code. It's companies, can't afford to wait 6 months to put a layoff plan in place if they're pivoting as a 10-person startup. What do you think about that? I mean, what needs to be done, if anything, in your view?
Well, I suppose we need to hear that message as well, even though I get from the report that I think it's 92% of the employees in startups are in long-term stable employment contracts, which is interesting because if the startups needed more flexibility, well, why would they use that kind of contract? I'm just asking.
Well, you could argue that they in order to hire, you want people permanently, but then you have to pivot. I mean, that's the danger as a startup. I might say I'm going to hire these programmers, and those programmers are going to demand CDI because that's what they deserve. They're going to demand to be paid well, and then suddenly 6 months from now, my concept doesn't work, and I need to turn on a dime, and I can't. I mean, what do you say about that situation?
But you're right. I think it's one way to compete with larger companies that are in a capacity to attract the best talents, probably more than startups, simply because they can pay them. So I think what we've done on stock options was extremely important, especially for startups, because it's just a way to retribute and to remunerate employees within the company when we're not sure about what the profits are going to be in the future. So that's one thing we've done, and I think it needs to be more known and it needs to be acknowledged as well. On the labor front, I was with the French president this morning, and he again raised the fact that we're currently working on the subject. We will reform the Code du Travail, the labor code, keeping in mind that it's becoming more and more difficult in the digital world to differentiate between an entrepreneur and an employee. And so certainly the categories that were defined tens of years ago need to be rethink in the digital age. So this promises to be a very interesting political debate.
Well, speaking of political debates, you're going to unveil your proposal for a new digital law next week. Hot on that topic. I mean, you have things like the right to be forgotten, net neutrality in there, open data. Why are those the issues that you focused on? There was a proposal for platform neutrality that had been bandied about. Benoît Toulon, I think, is here, and he talked about the need for regulation of that. Why leave that out of your proposal?
Because I think the responsibility we have as a national regulator is to ask ourselves what can be done at the European level and what should be done at the domestic level. So it's important to work with our European partners when it's possible and to go ahead with some reforms in France when we realize that either there's no consensus or nothing will happen in Brussels on some subjects, or maybe go even beyond what's been agreed. For example, on open data, we've decided to go far beyond like this sort of basic principle. So we will be opening public data by default, which is a small revolution in itself. It means that public administrations will have as a principle to open their data. So that bill I'm preparing, and which is going to be published as of next week on a digital platform and will be open to interaction with the public, and any citizen will be able to post comments or even to change the law and suggest new amendments. Well, that bill, the first chapter is about the economy of data, because in the 20th century, the economic value in the capitalistic system was based on material and natural resources. And that's the model for traditional industries. The biggest economic value at the moment is data. And this is not material, it's immaterial. And I think the institutions, the economy, the society, the way they work, it doesn't fit that sort of new model. So we're opening public data, we're working, with the private sector to see how we could foster the opening of private data, especially for startups to use these data. I would like to see the creation of a mission d'intérêt public, service public de la donnée. This may sound very, very French, but it's this idea that public institutions have, amongst their other duties, a duty to manage data. So to think about the strategy of use of their own data and sharing of their own data and collaboration with other entities. So it's just to change the way we look and we focus on the priorities at the moment.
All right. Well, it looks like we're basically out of time, but just one last question on a subject of news today. There was before the Constitutional Council, there was a case brought by Uber saying that the new loi Thévenu that outlaws UberPop should be unconstitutional. They say that it would outlaw the whole sharing economy. The argument is that I'm curious what you think. Should something like UberPop be allowed to exist or not?
So I don't have any scoop. I don't know what the decision of the council is. I think especially from abroad, the way this has been looked at is probably misconceived in the sense that Uber is very welcome in France, and for a very simple reason is that we're the perfect market. So they're certain to find consumers, just like Airbnb or other platforms. The problem, as you said, is UberPop. For another very simple reason is that there was a law passed by national legislators who got elected by the French people, and they decided that a service like UberPop should be prohibited, and Uber decided to offer it to customers anyway. And I think my regret, if I can express one, is the way they entered in a confrontation with the government, and they did that in France, but they did that with other countries. And from my experience, I can see that this is not always the case. I mean, we do have a very constructive dialogue with many companies when it comes to accommodating the regulation to their needs and to the new needs of customers. And clearly, there is a new need here, and we need to acknowledge that. But the way it happened was, to me, counterproductive. And here we have, this regretful result. So, again, for the regulator, and I'm not a judge and I'm not a lawyer, it means that we'll have to put the question on the table again and probably update the law that I think when it was voted last year was ideally a good compromise, but is inapplicable in practice and clearly not satisfying to all. So we'll just have to find a different solution.
All right. Well, a lot of new solutions to come. Thank you very much, Axelle, LEMAIRE, for being here today.
Thank you.
And we now have a 5-minute break, and so thank you very much.
Thank you.